Take it a second.
We're live. All right. Well, hello and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy. With me, as always, is Cecil. Hello, Cecil. And yeah, this is the This Is Not Therapy Hour. Together we work with our practice effective artistry with some others. Sarah, who's not here, but has been in the past. And what we're doing is same as always. We spend an hour a week just hanging out and talking to people, answering questions, going over whatever. So those of you who are here in chat, and thank you, Kitchbush, for putting your pronouns there. Yeah, we're going to talk about whatever the people that are here in chat want to talk about. Every week we pick a theme. The theme this week is sequencing. So we'll start off by talking about that just to make it easier to get into a conversation. But what we end up talking about, that's part of the fun of it, I guess. And part of the advantage of being somebody who's actually here is that you get to, shape where we go. Is that about cover what we need to cover, Cecil?
Yeah, I'll change it up a little bit.
Did I? Did I do it differently? Yeah. That's the problem with not having a script is I'm not sure. That's why every time I have to ask you if I messed up.
Yeah.
That inconsistency. So sequencing. Let's talk about sequencing. I'm not sure how we arrived at this topic. Cecil and Sarah do a wonderful job of choosing our topics and, kind of, I'm sure partly informed by things that our clients are coming into contact with and things that we personally are dealing with, just whatever's on our mind. But sequencing is an interesting one. I'll define it first, like in the way that for most people, if you've heard it in terms of executive functioning, like what that official kind of definition is, because sequencing is one of the common labels for one of the executive sub-functions. And we've talked in the past about how every different researcher, every different expert labels, categorizes different functions underneath executive functioning in different ways. So people will define it differently, which is good because it's different in different contexts and different definitions have different utility to different people. So it's good.
I feel like
go ahead.
There's maybe some point in time we're gonna have to make a song about these things. I just feel like there's like old school, like what is it, like conjunction function or whatever,
Yeah, that would be good.
It's your executive function.
We can do a whole YouTube channel series, just School of Rock. No, not School of Rock. What was that called? Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah, Schoolhouse Rock.
Anyway, so sequencing is the ability to hold things in sensical order. And with all of these definitions, like some of those words are pretty fungible, right? Like what does it mean sensical? Because obviously a lot of times people think chronological, and that is one way of putting things in an order that makes sense. But sensical order just means that I am conveying the information or able to convey the information to other people in a structure that they can follow. So yes, telling a story in chronological order is one way to do that, but also like what we do, right? If we start with a generic topic of executive functioning and then get more and more and more specific is another way. It's really just about, can other people follow the order that I am putting out there? And obviously we don't always put, whatever we're sequencing, we don't actually need to communicate or attempt to communicate. It's something that we do in our own head and only in our own head a lot of the time. But that's still like the definition is, if I needed to, would I be able to put it out there in a way that makes sense, right? Now for us, because people will talk about, I'm good at this one, bad at that one, right? Like I'm bad at sequencing, good. And that's fine. That's a subjective thing. I feel like other people are better than me at it, or I feel like I'm better at it than I am at other sub-functions or whatever. All those things are fine. But just remember that what we're talking about is the amount of resources that it takes to do. So with sequencing in particular, it's tricky because there's two different things that get conflated. One is, am I capable of putting something in order? If I have a plan, I want to accomplish X, can I on paper list out every step that needs to be done between now and arriving at X? Which is something that sequencing obviously is involved in. But a separate thing is, even if I can do that, or even if I've already done that, how much of my awareness does it take up in order to hold that sequence? So, as an example, if I have a goal of, I don't know, losing 10 pounds, let's say, and I'm doing X, Y, and Z, I change how I'm eating and whatever, I go work out. As I'm working out, my awareness is going to various things, right? There are things that I know intellectually, meaning that they're in long-term memory. There are things that I know in the sense that I have them stored somewhere that I know where they are and have access to them. But there's what's I'm aware of is what I'm presently conscious of. And so the sequence of, if I'm on step one of a 100-step plan, even though I know all 100 steps of it, when I'm engaged in step one, I am not consciously aware necessarily of step 100. So for some people, holding sequences takes less room. For some, it takes more. So for some people, when they're on step one of a 100-step plan, it feels like progress, right? It's like, okay, yes, this step sucks, but I am currently aware of the fact that everything I'm doing is getting me closer to step 100. For other people, it's, man, this sucks. Why am I doing this again? You know, and we can be reminded, or we can take a pause and like think, okay, right, because of this and because of that. But it's harder to hold just presently all the time, because if we do, it takes up more space, more of our resources that go to other things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So is this kind of like what we refer to as like people who have vision? You know, like oh, they can see it. Is that like kind of the same?
Say more about what you mean, because maybe, but
you know, like so someone's doing something and they're trying to explain it to you, like notorious for this, where I just say like nonsense words. I'm like, oh, but I know it'll work, and then I can follow through all these steps because I know what it's going to look like at the end. Opposed to some people, other times, I guess, use myself an example where, like I don't see that like end result isn't like either like I'm not focused on it or remembering it, or it's just kind of like out of sight, out of mind thing. So it's harder for me to engage in the process.
Definitely in the sense
that
like
that.
No, I mean, so yes, vision, or you know, having goals, knowing what you want, whatever. Part of that is, and to get real like abstract, part of that is irreducible. You know, part of that is volition. It's if you like a thing or don't like a thing, you can't really break it down further than that. You know what I mean? Like we can analyze it, we can make guesses about, oh, maybe you like this thing because X, Y, or Z, but we're guessing at that. The fact that you like it or don't like it is just thing that you know and feel, regardless of what, you know, cognitive explanations you have, right? Mm-hmm. So vision is partly that, like how much do I know about what I like, what I want. And it's also partly about intellect, like we've talked, the ability to focus on non-present data, you know, look at patterns and make predictions. Did that just destroy everyone's ears?
Yeah.
I am so sorry.
I'm going to mute you for a second till you get that adjusted, because that was a terrible sound. Give me the thumbs up whenever you are back so that we know to turn your mic back on. And sorry about that, everybody. That was less than pleasant and less than ideal. And also, while we wait, happy end of Pride Month. Today's the end of June, so I hope everyone had a wonderful Pride and enjoyed themselves. And it's an exciting month with a lot of cool things. You know, from Juneteenth being an official holiday now to celebrating Pride. So, and Brandon's back.
Yes, I'm sorry that nobody is allowed to be proud of themselves anymore, but it was fun while it lasted. Mm-hmm. Actually, in this little, you know, our office here is in Northbrook, Illinois, which is, you know, a cute little suburb, and I really liked that they put up like progress flags. The village put up progress flags in all the downtown areas and stuff. It was nice to have that kind of governmental, at least, acknowledgement, regardless of how symbolic or whatever it is. It's still at least a symbol. But then today I'm watching out the window as they're like taking the bucket truck around to pull them all down, and it made me a little mad, which is not, you know, like, I'm like, how dare you take it down? But obviously it was just for Pride Month, you know. Anyway, I'm really sorry. I don't know why my microphone felt like that, but
I mean, it's probably just a ghost. So it's the most logical explanation.
Yeah, so, fair enough. Sequencing. Oh yeah, yeah. Vision. So part of it is the ability to see things that are not there, and how to and using logic to get from A to B, or pattern recognition and whatever. But to take that vision of whatever it is that you want, and then to design, reverse engineer how to get there, to make a plan or steps or whatever. A lot of that involves sequencing, and of course it involves other things as well. So some people won't refer to sequencing as a subfunction. Some will just say planning. Some will have sequencing and planning as two separate things. Because like research, for example, that you need to do that would be involved in planning isn't necessarily involved in sequencing. It's just holding things in order. And really, if we get like real deep and abstract about this, a lot of this is about like schema construction and how we link bits of data to other bits of data in our minds, and blah, blah, blah. But part of what you're asking, I think, Cecil, is, let's say I do design a plan that goes from step 1 to 100, and I really care about 100 and I really hate step 1. Then when I'm doing step 1, how do I feel? And yes, sequencing is definitely part of that. If you are more presently aware of whatever it is that you're going for and how you're getting closer to it by doing whatever it is that you're doing, even if that thing is unenjoyable, it will be more enjoyable if it feels like it's connected to the thing, instead of just knowing that it's connected to the thing. I feel like that is when I say no, I mean I have access to that information, either because it's in my head or because I have it somewhere that I can find it. When I say aware, I mean that it is presently something I am conscious of. I don't need to go retrieve it from long-term memory. I'm aware of it. It's right here, right now.
Okay. This sounds a little bit like when we talked about like one of our earlier streams, talking about goals and stuff, and it's really interesting to talk about like, oh yeah, like breaking it down to like instead of seeing step 100 and just, step 1, it's hard to see that. So it's kind of an interesting callback to that. I mean, like goals, plannings, habits, all these things we talked about are just seem like different variants and different ways of explaining the same things.
Yeah, I mean, really they are. That's why everybody chunks it up in different ways, because one of the things we talked about at the very beginning, and maybe it'd be good for me to revisit more frequently, is we don't care about accuracy, we care about utility. If I could say a sequence of gibberish syllables and somehow that enabled you to feel differently or act differently or think differently in a way that made things more the way you want them to be, then good. I don't care if it's accurate or not. I care about what's useful. So yes, a lot of it is just different language for similar concepts. There are times for me all the time that, like, as I'm thinking through and constructing my way of looking at things and executive functioning, whatever, I'll arrive at a conclusion and I'll be like, oh, maybe this is what everybody meant when they said this other thing that I always like wrote off because what I thought they meant didn't make sense. But maybe they meant this thing that I understand now because I kind of came at it from a different way. So yeah, it is. It's all arbitrary. It's all constructs. None of it is actually observable. It's all just abstract concepts. We just keep trying new and different ones that work, at least for some people. If it doesn't work for you, then we find a new one. We make up a new one. And if none of them do, then you keep working until you find one, or you don't, So I do think it's important to remember that all right, a little bit off track, but competition is not generally helpful, I'll say. Obviously, there are exceptions to that, but generally approaching things from a worldview of better than, worse than, or zero-sum game style, everything you have is a thing I can't have kind of stuff, is generally not as helpful as alternatives. In this specific context, what I mean is thinking of oneself as good at sequencing or bad at sequencing, or as intelligent or not, or good at blank, bad at blank, typically is not very helpful when you're doing it in a comparative sense, unless you're looking for a competitive advantage, right? Like if what you're saying is, oh, I want to go into business and this business is, this is a saturated industry, but I'm especially good at blank and that's why I will be able to make a living there. What we're talking about is not, when we're talking about executive functioning or intelligence, anything cognitive, anything, neurological, or we're not talking about capacity, we're talking about efficiency. That It's not about there are things that you can sequence that I cannot. It's what it costs you to sequence it is different from what it might cost me to sequence it. And the reason for the variation in that cost can be a million different things, but that's what we're talking about, not can I be aware? How much does it cost me to be aware? So the more it costs me, or another way to put it is this: we do tests to measure people's working memory because it's generally thought, it's generally agreed upon that people have different space in their working memory. Some people can hold more data in working memory, some people can hold less, which is fine. Again, tests are valid and they're helpful, but they're flawed and limited. Because the other way that we could describe this, and there is no way for us to be able to tell the difference, is for each person, different types of data, different pieces of data take up different amounts of space in the working memory. So whether it's a global increased working memory capacity or just that the types of information that we're testing you on are types of information that you can hold by using fewer resources than other people might, either way the result is the same. You hold more than other people. But for the individual, because if we just think of it as a static, I have only so much room in my working memory, as opposed to the things that I'm dealing with, I can take, they take more or less room depending on other things, right? Primarily schema. I feel like I'm being very
it's very, but it makes me ask questions of this is probably too abstract, but talk about the idea of novel concepts opposed to familiarity can affect then your quote unquote perceived capacity for working memory.
Right. For instance, if you were to give me a list of 15 English words and ask me to remember them, and then later, control theoretically, hypothetically, control every other variable, repeat the experiment, but give me a list of 15 words in a language that I don't speak, I'm probably going to have a lot easier or have more success retaining those English words than the ones in a language I don't speak, because they connect to things that I know. So I need smaller markers to remember them, as opposed to, oh gosh, I got to remember the whole thing. You mean they're taking in more data? Well, this really is out there and I suppose controversial, but some people theorize that neurodiversity or neurodivergence, or that at least part of that is about an increased global perceptive capacity. And I'm not on board or not on board with that. I think it's just a different way of describing what we're talking about. But yes, some people will say that, for example, auditory sensitivity is because somebody, for whatever reason, is able to take more things into awareness rather than, just that type of data gets prioritized more. So that's one theory. And again, no way we would ever know, but that's what our system is built on, is this competitive aspect, this idea that there are finite resources. And so we need to identify the people who need the resources, quote unquote, need the resources versus who don't, which sometimes makes sense because some resources are finite, and sometimes doesn't make so much sense because everyone would benefit from exchange or whatever. But yeah, we're being real abstract. I feel like I should get a specific question here going.
This also reminds me a little bit of just sequencing, keeping things going, is in She-Ra, not no spoiler alerts, the animated series on Netflix, there's a character named Madame Raz, and the sequencing kind of how it's not that she's better or worse at sequencing, it's just different. And I'll say that. So anybody wants to watch that, it's towards the end of the series. So
multiple times someone has mentioned to me a character from, I want to say Steven Universe. Yes, Steven Universe. And I think her name is Garnet. You would know this, right?
Yeah.
That she has a magic ability to see potential futures. Do you know this character? I thought.
Yeah, I know Garnet. Also, spoiler alert, everyone, for Steven Universe stuff. So.
Oh, I didn't know that was a spoiler. I haven't watched it. I just assumed that was.
It's not too much of a spoiler alert, but yes, Garnet is able to see potential futures and a relation to probability. So the more probable it is, the more accessible it is. So the less probable, the less accessible or less noted that it is, which is really fascinating. So
what I love about that is literally what we all do all the time. I love that it gets turned into a magic power, but we all see multiple possible potential futures, and the more likely that one is dunamancy. Yeah, some Exandria stuff going on there. Happy birthday, Matt Mercer, yesterday or 2 days ago. Anyway, dunamancy is time magic from our D&D Dragons. Yes, the more likely a future is, the more we're going to be aware of it, because the more data there is that exists in our present reality or that we have observed in other places apply to that future. Therefore, it's more likely. You know what I mean? Like if I interact with somebody and every time I interact with them, they yell at me, then I'm going to be more aware of the potential future of them yelling at me again because I have data to support that, you know? And obviously I haven't watched the show. I'm sure that there are nuances to it that I'm not getting in like brief descriptions, but either way, I like that, you know, to see potential futures like all of us do every day.
It's note to self, or for everybody, like cartoons are incredible, so everyone should watch them. They're not just for children, but
that's true. Let's do something specific about sequencing, putting things in a sensical order.
Okay. Let's, I mean, like one that's pretty common is like scheduling. I know that in the past we've talked about like, you know, scheduling resources versus time and everything else, but like that feels like a type of sequencing of just being able to like, oh, hey, actually, let me get to that point. So when I'm wanting to do something, so I want to accomplish a task, sometimes I get stuck in that first phase where I'm like, oh, I got to think through every single step. And like, I'm not able to put it all in order and jump around a lot. What would be beneficial or helpful in that situation?
Great question. And yes, this is a very common thing for people who, you know, it takes more resources for them to sequence things. So the further out something is, the harder it is, you know, the less likely that they'll do it, and etc. I love the Robert Frost Two Roads Diverged in a Yellow Wood poem for this specific topic, partly because I'm weird and I'm fascinated with things where, like, you know, our general culture takes them to mean different than what they clearly mean if you actually look at it, like bootstrapping and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And a lot of people know the first and the last lines of this poem, Two Roads Diverge in a Yellow Wood, and then the last line is, I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. But if you read the poem, because then people take it as like, oh, you know, make your own path, take the more unusual path or whatever. What it actually is he comes to a fork in the road in the forest while he's out on a hike, and each branching path looks exactly the same to him. That's the bulk of the poem, is him saying, I looked down each path as far as I could see and could not tell any difference between these two things. So for a while I stalled out because I couldn't tell which was a better path to take. And then at one point I told myself I'll come back tomorrow and take the other path, even though I know I won't actually probably do that. So I became paralyzed by needing to make a decision, but not being certain about which decision will yield better results for me. And then eventually to the end, he comes up with, I just picked one. I just picked one for no reason. I couldn't find a good reason that one was better than the other, but I didn't want to be stuck at the fork for the rest of my life. So I picked one and I went. And that has made all the difference. Meaning that every choice that you make impacts the rest of your life. And of course, I'm not a literary scholar. I'm sure somebody else could come in here and tell me that that's not what he intended, but that's what I get out of it. But yeah, every choice we make impacts the rest of our life. So yes, it makes all the difference, but that's kind of the point, is that if you treat every decision as though it impacts the rest of your life, well, that's true, including the things that you don't make conscious decisions about. But if you treat it as though it's so important because it impacts the rest of your life that you can't make a decision until you are certain that it will work out, then you stall out forever. And the simple way to talk about this is, you know, thought versus action. You know, where's the balance? We've talked about this. Where's the balance of how much I should think about a thing before acting on a thing? And I do have a specific framework that I think we've shared before.
Yeah, we talked about that a lot in our procrastination and perfectionism stream.
Yeah. So same thing. So sequencing, or again, prioritization is another word that gets used, overlapping, or, you know, as a subset of or whatever, and planning gets used. What that means is basically the cognitive processes that are a variable that would allow us to see further down the path. Some people can see further down the path than others can. No one can see forever, and no one can be entirely accurate. but for some people it's easier to see further and therefore have more data to make decisions on. And if that's the case, if that's true, then you get used to doing it that way. So when you come to a place where you can't get that information, it's more likely that you stall out until you can. Or if you're told that a decision, cough, college, cough, is uber important, and we know that you've never had a chance in your life to actually think about what you want, 17-year-old in America, like that you've mostly, which is obviously a little bit of criticism there, but yeah, kids, we ask them what to do or tell them what to do because they don't know as much. But anyway, at 17, all of a sudden, okay, now choose where you're going to live for the next 4 years and what you're going to study and what you're going to have your career in for the next rest of your life. And it's the most important and impactful decision you've ever made. And it's the very first time that we're saying, you got to tell us what you want. And nobody has any idea. So we have these ridiculous frameworks of like, do you want a big school or a small school? How would I know? I've not been to a big school or a small school. I can make guesses and hopefully those guesses are correct or helpful. Anyway, getting off on a specific one. But yeah, sequencing, the better you are able to hold information about how things go in order in relation to each other with smaller resources expended on it, the more you can be aware without, spending as many resources.
So what if you're just not good at that? So things I'm really familiar with, or I can recognize quickly, I can see and get done quickly. And oftentimes with someone, I'm not able to articulate what I need. I just tell them like, oh, do that. And they're like, why? And then also when towards the end they go, oh, now I get it. But things that are like novel to me, I really struggle with that, like sequencing. What are things that I can like do in real terms to like practice that behavior, to structure it so that I can overcome that? Because like when I try new things, it's hard because I'm like, I don't know where to start. Yeah. And I don't know where I'm going with it. So
yeah, that's a good question. And my first answer is going to be the same answer I give for everything, which is communication. You can't know what you don't know, but if other people know it, they can maybe communicate it to you so you can ask questions. But let's get past that because that's almost always true and there are limits on when you can use it or not. So this is where we talk about processes. So I think in the past I've used the phrase like mimicry versus integration, or learning new rules versus being able to adapt in the moment, which is something that, never mind, I was going to get off on an intelligence thing again, not relevant. So develop processes, and all that we really mean when we say processes is more generally applicable rules. How do I respond to the question, how are you? I'm fine. That's a specific rule. But if I get a more general rule of how do I respond when people are saying a question where they clearly don't want like a long answer, okay, I give them a short answer that placates them, right? Like then that works for that situation, but for other situations as well. And in particular, it's about learning to listen and observe, to step back when it's time to step back and gather data, and then to go when it's time to go and to know the difference. So yeah, a novel thing, if you don't have the opportunity to get information about it from other people in advance, which can include reading books or articles, that's still information from other people, so that you can't prepare, you got to be there and just adapt in the moment. And some neurodivergent people are exceptional at that, like, well beyond the norm. And some neurodivergent people are just awful at that. And if you disrupt the routine at all, will struggle mightily. So you got to kind of know yourself. And then you scaffold those things. Because again, sometimes you got only bad choices, And in those cases, it is about taking the choice that's the least bad. But there's not always a solution of, okay, I struggle with completely novel and overwhelming situations. Then sometimes the answer is, let's not put you in novel and overwhelming situations unless we absolutely have to, not here's what you can do to be better at that thing, right?
Okay.
But in your case, communication ahead of time, or this hypothetical case. And then secondly, to be able to create space for you to approach it slowly, to figure out one piece at a time, to digest one piece at a time, rather than trying to integrate and sequence all that information at once. So say you're going to a party, a house party with a bunch of people you don't know, it's college, everybody's drunk and it's overwhelming. I am a very social person, when I was in these situations, even now, I'm like, oh God, that sounds awful. But if you have a process, like, okay, first thing I'm going to do is find where's the door so that I can leave if I want to. Second thing I'm going to do is find where's the bathroom, or where's the food, or I'm going to do I'm going to walk through every room with an empty cup in my hand so that no one approaches me to try and give me anything, and just see who all is there and identify if there are any people there that I know and am familiar with. And then if so, I'm just making up a process right now, but that's a process because it can apply to each house party, as opposed to rules being like, okay, I'm going to Dave's place tonight and I know this person and this person will be there, so I can prepare it this way for that specific environment. Comments.
This comment before is kind of, I feel like, very reminiscent of what it was asking. Talk about, like, I'll put it up here. It's like, I've been really difficult to even start outlining a thing until I'm very familiar with the process or topic, and I'm not entirely sure why. I know I'm bad at putting boundaries around complex concepts.
I like that. Of course, my initial responses are all very abstract, and I feel like I've done that so much today, so I'm trying not to. But in essence, what you're talking about is a lot of what we say when we say someone is creative, or say that someone has ADHD or whatever, right? That kind of the whole point is that for whatever reason, my brain is not segmenting information and data into the same categories that other people are. So even though the task ahead of me is to write this email, for whatever reason, my brain is still prioritizing this information over here and bringing it in, even though it may or may not be relevant to this task. So when you're talking about putting boundaries around complex concepts, that's part of what you're talking about, is for whatever reason, your brain, however you want to define it, has noticed more things that are supposedly irrelevant, and sometimes utilized those things to solve the problem, sometimes in new and better and more efficient ways, sometimes not. Sometimes you don't use it at all and it's just a distraction. But the more you do that, the harder it's going to be to put a boundary around something and say, no, this is love. Nothing outside of this is love. This is clearly defined, because you have lived experience that things that don't necessarily connect to a thing can connect later, or maybe do, but you just didn't know how. Now, I find it really difficult to even start outlining a thing until I'm familiar with a process or topic. Yeah, now part of that can be about sequencing, for sure, that you want to have more data and, again, be able to compress that data more. The more thoroughly you know and understand a thing, what we're saying is that you're able to carry that data forward in more simplistic ways. Intelligence at the root of it, if we're going to talk about it as a comparative trait, is the ability to accurately identify which parts of a thing are valuable data and which parts are not, so that you know which parts to pull out and you can leave the rest behind. In other words, if I'm in my car and it starts making a funny noise, I don't have the knowledge and the schema to say, okay, it could be out of this or that, and let me, work through it. It's got to be something's wrong with the carburetor. Instead, I'm like, okay, what is that? It's like a, and that's what I tell somebody, because I can't compress the data any more than that. So I'm doing my best to convey the full complexity of the data, and I can't do it very well because it's more complex than I can carry and recreate. And even
and you don't know what's important, what's not important, all sorts of things, because it's like you go there and they're like, oh, when you did this, what did you do? What happened then? You're like, oh, I wasn't paying attention to every single detail at all moments, and then
So let's move let's move past the abstract part of it and get into the practical, because none of that prevents you from starting outlining a thing or from taking action on a plan. There is a mindset shift of how certain do I have to be that this will succeed by whatever criteria I'm defining success before I am willing to start or put any resources towards it at all. And in particular, that ND people, especially everybody, but especially ND people, have a tendency to consider some things resource expenditure and not others. In other words, what I will see happen all the time is people thinking, spending so much time and energy thinking about a thing, but not want to take action on it because I haven't figured out the plan yet and I don't want to spend any resources on it. in case it turns out that it doesn't work or I want something else later or whatever. But this is resource expenditure. So we're setting up an arbitrary division between, oh, thinking is fine, but actually doing something, that's a waste unless I know it's going to work out. Thinking is doing something. So there's that. Secondly, you're assessing for safety. Everybody is assessing for safety at all times, meaning what are the possibly bad or harmful outcomes of a thing? If I start outlining a thing and a colleague might look over it before I feel like I'm ready to share it with them, and they see it in a process where I'm not ready for them to see it and they judge me and they think of me differently, like that's a lot scarier than if it's like, well, I'll just start outlining it here and add to it as I figure out more, right? So there might be, and again, that can be accurate or inaccurate. You can be scared about outcomes because there are good reasons to be scared about outcomes, or you can be scared about outcomes just because even though it doesn't seem like there's any evidence that it might happen, it's just too scary anyway. So yeah, go back to the framework of idea to beat, meaning the first step is if you had to do it right now, if you had to, whatever stupid hypothetical scenario you want to put in for that, people always say gun to your head, which I hate, but it's a hypothetical scenario. Assume whatever conditions you need to assume in order to dictate that you must start this thing within the next 3 seconds. You put whatever you got, no matter how terrible it is, you've got something, because you wouldn't be thinking about it if you didn't have at least some idea, right? So whatever that is, the answer to that question is your idea to beat. And then you got 2 more questions after that before you actually start going. Question 1 is there specific information that I am confident exists that I may or may not know how to access, but I am confident it exists and I theoretically could find it? So that's one. The second question is there something I could do other than engaging in this activity or this idea or plan or whatever? Is there something else I can do that I think will give me information that impacts this plan, even if I don't know what information that might be? If the answer to either of those questions is yes, okay, then go get that information or do whatever you need to do in order to find that information, or at least start that process, or go do that thing that you think will get you information. But if the answer to both of those is no, I don't know any specific information to look for, and no, I don't have a specific action that I can take that might get me more information, then obviously you still don't have to do it. But if you're waiting for more information, if the answer to both those questions is no, the last thing that we know you can do that will get you more information is start with your crappy idea. Just do that, because success, failure, whatever, you'll get more data from doing it. And then, of course, the fourth option is to not do any of those things. I'm not going to get new information. I'm not going to do experiences that get me new information. And I'm not going to start this plan until I have a better one. And then what? Then we're waiting. We're hoping. And sooner or later, you might get information because things happen that are outside of your control. And some of those things might be like, hey, here's oh, yes, okay, great. That helped me with my plan. I can go. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it happens quickly. But either way, you're waiting and it's out of your control. So that's the framework. Idea to beat, specific information, even if I don't know how to find it, specific action, even if I don't know what information it might get me. If no to both of those, do the idea that you came up with.
This next statement I can relate to a little too much. But like, this is what I feel like I struggle with. Like, sequencing, again, is just an arbitrary word, but sometimes I feel like I struggle with this, even with things I'm either familiar with or are still novel to me, is this kind of concept here. I feel like I'm trying to draw a picture I have in my head, but there's no translation onto paper. So when I grab the pencil, I can't start drawing. There's no connection there. It's like I'm trying to break down a complex topic. I end up with dozen pieces of complex topic. And I feel like I can't even write those pieces down until I have them clearly defined.
So another way that people will break executive functioning down into a subcategory is transition, which a lot of times people mean the ability for a person to transition from one task to another. but this is a form of transition as well. Where do I find the related pieces between one thing and the next so that I can link them to each other? So if we put it in terms of writing a paper, because that just makes it easier to like, put a concrete example to. Standard 5-paragraph structure, right? Intro, body, 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 conclusion, and very basic by the numbers. I have 3 different reasons, right? I think dogs are the best pet because they're loyal and they're furry and they're fun. I don't know. Cecil could give real answers. I'm just making crap up. Well, okay, I can write a paragraph about how they're loyal and a paragraph how furry and a paragraph for fun. But how do I flow from one into the next? How do I find the transition? And in that case, and potentially in the case that you're talking about here, the question, a very practical question, is mention something that came before and mention something that comes next. Obviously, cats are fluffier and therefore better. Actually, I have a kind of a theory that certain kinds of ND people love cats, partly because they are fluffier, partly because the purring is vibration, and because they're smaller and can like sit on you and you can feel that tactile pressure and the vibration of their purring that you can feel responsible for, similar to like houseplants are for some people, but with more of a tactile focus. Anyway, never mind. So mention what came before and mention what comes next. So the by the numbers way to do this in a 5-paragraph structure essay is, sure, dogs are loyal, but they're also fluffy. Like literally that crappy of a sentence mentioned the former thing and the next thing. Now, that's a specific concrete example, but what we're doing internally is the same thing, utilizing language to connect piece A to piece B. That's what I mean when I say schema. Schema is connected pieces of data. If I say dog, then you envision a dog, or you think of breeds, or you think of, a bark or a pet, or all things that are connected for whatever reason in your brain, so you can follow those chains. And yes, we use language for that. And I'll say again, I say this all the time, language is not just words. And I don't even mean not just spoken words. Obviously, it's not just spoken words. There are, pictographic languages and sign language and things like that. But I mean, it's not even just words meaning predefined and shared things that have some kind of shared meaning, right? Because, okay, I don't know if I need to go off further on that. What I mean when I say language is symbolic representation, that you have done data compression, that you have taken something that does not intrinsically contain the data of this other thing, but you have created a connection between those things. So when I say desk, that's just that's a sound. It sounds I'm making with my throat and whatever. It travels through the air, but you decode it and it's a word, and you don't even recognize that it's a word. You just think desk, whatever that means to you. So we have those shared languages, but internally we have some that are different, right? That make sense to me because it is symbolic representation or it's a link. So for example, if I were to say, I'm trying to think of an inside joke I have with my friends, because this is what inside jokes are, is language. It's I'm conveying a lot of data to you in a very short thing because this thing is connected to a schema that you and I share, or at least share parts of. There's some. So because you're talking about 2 different things. One is the ability to communicate this to other people. Putting it on paper, theoretically, at least part of the intention of putting it on paper is so that somebody else can read it and get something out of it. Part of that. What?
Is that your mic? I hear some quick feedback.
Uh-oh. Nothing changed.
Go ahead and see if does anybody else hear that? Is that just on my end? Make sure it's like I muted you there, Brandon, just so in case it was. So like the sound when a wire's loose. Wrestling. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you for letting us know. Go ahead. Mute you there, Brandon. Just that. Yeah, the one who has all the information is the one who's muted now. So let's see if that's better.
Is it better? I can change my mic. Okay.
Go ahead and change your mic. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we're in it. So keep sending in the comments so I have something to say. No. Cool. You good, Brandon?
Yeah. Do you hear me on this mic now?
Yeah, a little bit more quiet, but yeah.
Okay. You can argue about cats. Cecil does not share.
I like cats. Cats are very fascinating. I know a lot less about cats than I do dogs, but I think they're very fascinating creatures, especially their domestication process and their whole history. But that's beside the point. Their eyes are really fascinating. But
what I was saying, when for whatever reason I started getting feedback, and I'll have to figure that out, is that this is about language creation. Either because you're hesitant to put it on paper because you don't have language that you think other people will understand, or because in your own head you don't have language that allows you to create links in easy to use ways. That a link is very complex. In other words, you got to refigure it out every time, right? That we all have stuff like that, right? Stuff that we do and it works and it helps us and it's like nice and whatever, and then we forget, and then later on, as we're trying to make changes again, we come back to that and we're like, oh yeah, I forgot, I had already figured this out and I just figured it out again, right? Because we didn't create some way to contain that data in a compressed way, which is really what putting something into long-term memory is just compressing it in a way that you can access and re-expand later. We call it coding or processing, but that's just different language. Now, how do you do it is the same way as how do you do anything else. You got to do it. So Cecil, both you and Bast and Cider here are struggling with doing this because you're assessing for, will it be successful? Will it be beneficial? Will it be harmful to me? And whatever your assessments are coming out is that the risk is too high of trying because you don't think you'll be able to do it successfully. And what is the consequences or the results of that? Part of the reason that I'm good at doing this is, as Cecil and other people in my personal life will tell you, I talk a lot, and it's probably really annoying for people. Not probably, it definitely is. It causes problems. But it's because for whatever reason, it's not like some mental shift I made. I just happen to have developed this way of thinking or going about things is I'm gonna try. And it might be wrong and you might hate it. But if you do, I'll observe that you hate it because I'm pretty good at that too, because I do it this way. I need to observe whether you hate it because I know I tried something and I need to see how it worked. And if you do, I'll restate it in a different way or go to a different thing or try a different piece of it because I'm never going to stop trying. Even though I know that some of my attempts will harm people, and that's terrifying, and some of my attempts might harm me, and that's honestly less terrifying for me. Terrifying. But the other option is to not do it. So these concepts that are in your head, and I'm not saying one is better than the other. Obviously, I have my way that I have a tendency to do more often, but it's not about good and bad or right and wrong. It's just different. So we're talking about what the options are. If you are trying to do a thing, communicate a complex topic, and you cannot, for whatever reason, figure out in your head a plan to do that in a way that you feel confident will work, or that at least you feel confident won't cause you harm or cause other people harm or create some problem, something you don't want, then you have really two options. You try the best thing you can try and gather that data to try again, or you don't. And the more you try a thing, the better you get because you get more data. Every time you try, you get more information to integrate. So yes, the long and short of it is at the end that I can make anything about anything and blah, blah, blah. I'm really good with words. But not because I have some like organic, or at least whatever extent it's organic, has still contributed to the fact that I've been doing it a lot over the entire course of my life, because that is the only way to get better. There are other variables that dictate how much better or how quickly or what a better even mean. But the only way to do something more efficiently, um, more safely, whatever, is to have more information about that thing. And there are different ways to get information, but experience is always one. So yeah, if you're thinking, okay, I might try and describe this complex topic in this way, but I don't think anybody will get that. So let me try and think of another way that I can describe it so that other people will get, or so that it will make sense to me, or that I'll be happy with it. And maybe you'll come up with one eventually and put it down, or maybe you won't. And if you don't, and you're not comfortable putting out the best one that you can, then you stagnate at this specific skill. You'll be doing other things instead, right? None of us just don't do anything. It just means, okay, I'm not comfortable with that, so I'm not doing that. So I'll do this other stuff, and then you'll get better at that other stuff. That's the thing for me. I feel like I'm not worried about failing. Maybe it's just that I can't accept an idea that is not clearly defined.
So I hope this is I to like me. I get that my struggle is being misunderstood in a sense, or being unclear and creating the problems of that. And I'm not sure if this is the same as that, but yeah.
Well, it can be. And of course, as always, it depends on what we mean by failing. But obviously, Cecil, or at least I think that's part of what you're saying, is you're worried about expressing something that has consequences or contributes to things that you don't want to happen, right? So that's one way of defining failing, and maybe Fast Insiders thinking of a different way. But also, another thing that we can be talking about here is, by definition, things that you are aware of bother you. And I know that sounds weird because a lot of the time we're aware of things that we really enjoy and we're imagining fun things and whatever. But if that's the case, it's because we're trying to figure out how to get more of it, or how to do it better, or whatever it is. Like, we can never know the why. We just know that the brain only brings the information in that it finds relevant for one reason or another. So there's something there that the brain is trying to get. If something is taking up a lot of your awareness, once something is in awareness, there's only two options. It either gets forgotten, or it gets put into long-term memory. And there's a lot of sub-options in both of those categories, but it's those two things. So if it's something important, whether it's because it's urgent and bad, or whether because it's really enjoyable and I want to remember it for the future or whatever, I don't want to forget it. So I'm going to keep it in awareness until I process it into long-term memory. And processing into long-term memory is a process of data compression. So in and of itself, an idea that is not clearly defined, part of what maybe you're experiencing or trying to communicate there is that it is just the act of, I'm thinking about this thing because it's so complex. It's the car noise, and I don't have it clearly defined because I don't know what elements I need to retain and what elements I can drop and lose. And so I'm keeping it all until I can clearly define it, meaning until I can get a sense of how I can package it, what other schema I can attach it to, or what language I can use to define it, or what elements of it I can let go. That makes sense. We always want, as just a baseline universal rule, we always want to free up resources. The brain does not want to spend resources unless it has a reason to. So the flip side of that is, if I'm spending resources on a thing, I want to stop spending resources on that thing unless I continue to be aware of the reason why I'm spending resources on it. And that does come back to sequencing, right? Because when you first get a job at 16 because you're trying to save up to buy a new computer or whatever, and you're doing the job interviews and starting and it's orientation and it's all novel, and you're like, okay, I'm doing this because I want to get that computer. But then week 2, when you're in like hour 5 of a terrible shift, and you're like, man, what the hell am I even doing here? This is the worst. Because that connection wasn't solidified in a way that you're able to keep present in awareness, or other things are not leaving space for it, or whatever it is.
So how do I get past keeping it all in your? So how do you get past keeping it all in your brain if you can't spend all the time or all the time needed to like put the whole concept in your brain on paper? Well, I feel like I read that poorly. Sorry.
Well, so a couple of things there. Again, first, we got to deal with the reality of what options exist to you. And the options that exist are keep it in your brain, put it out somewhere else, or forget it. That's it. Now, there are many, many, many ways to put it out. And one way that people get stuck a lot, again, especially ND people, is getting fixated on a specific way of getting that information offloaded, stored externally, and in particular writing. That it's either here or, everybody always tells me I got to write it down, I got to write it down. Well, we know that there are variables that make it difficult, costly in terms of time and energy and whatever for people to write things down. So if you think that your only options are to keep it in your head or write it down, then yeah, you're more likely to keep some things in your head if writing it down is a more costly task. Like you just said, time. I need more time. It takes time to write things down. Now, other ways to get things out of your head: talk about it with other people that you think will store the information and be able to get it back to you. Do voice recordings or voice to text, speech to text software that allows you to store information by using verbal language as opposed to written language. And art. Because what this is about taking data, compressing it, meaning putting it, attaching it to something symbolic. Because you're not in that painting that you just made, it does not actually contain the data that when you look at it, you will have in your head. But if you construct that link, then when you look at it, it will pull up all that stuff. Now, obviously, it's a less precise language than, than what most people call language, words. But that doesn't matter depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish. If what you're trying to store externally is an experience, is a feeling, is a vibe, then maybe putting it into painting is great. And obviously there's way more art than just painting. Putting it into a dance, putting it into a song or a melody or a rhythm or whatever. It's just symbolic connection. There's a reason that humans are drawn to art. It's communication. It's conveying complex things in simple ways. And, a corollary to that for me is the death of the author, meaning that whatever I put into my art, you're going to get out of it what you get out of it. Whether it is what I intended for you to get out of it or not, doesn't really matter. I get what I get, you get. So yeah, other ways to put things out of your brain. Or, again, you keep it in. That's it. You either put it out or you keep it in. Now, the other part, and I know we're coming up on time, is to be able to switch from a binary goal state to a granular or a spectrum kind of a thing. Meaning that instead of saying, I am going to not eat sugar for 5 days, a very simple and actionable shift is to say, I am aiming to go 5 days without sugar. Because if you go 4 hours without sugar and then have sugar, okay, you didn't hit your target exactly on, but you got closer than if you hadn't done anything, right? And you got data in that attempt that you can use if you want to try it again, or maybe data that helps you understand you don't want to try it again. Whereas if you set a binary goal state of I succeed or I fail, if I go 4.5 days and then eat sugar, I failed and I feel bad. And sometimes people will even feel worse because it's like, oh, I got so close before I failed. But take it out of that binary state and turn it into aim. I am going for, this is my idea of what I think will happen. But then when you're doing it, you have more information than you had when you set the intention, right? You get more data. So if I can't put the whole concept of my brain on paper, well, then I'll put what elements of it that I can. If it would take me 2 hours to get this whole thing down and figured out, and I have 10 minutes, well, I can get 10 minutes worth of it down, and that's more than 0. Now, sometimes you're not going to think that's worth it. Sometimes it's like, yeah, what I can accomplish in 10 minutes is worthless. I would rather spend those resources elsewhere, and that's fine. But if you're able to switch from the binary to the more granular, the spectrum kind of thing, then you're more likely to spend your resources on getting a part of the thing down instead of being paralyzed until you feel like you've got the entire thing figured out up here. And again, safety, which is a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about privileges. How frequently and in how many contexts do you feel safe or not safe? How much of your resources do you need to spend assessing for safety based on your prior experiences and what you've been communicated about? But yes, that's what we're looking for. It's a lot easier to put something out half in. Here's a good, very simple way to think about this. If you're an artist, you have an experience. Well, hell, if you're not an artist, we're all artists in some way. You have an experience of, here's a cool thing. that I kind of want to create and share with people, but I haven't done it all, or it's in a bad state or whatever. Here's a question: who or in what context do you feel like you can share it when it's in a bad state, a state that you identify as bad? Those are the people and those are the contexts in which you feel most safe. The more comfortable you feel with saying, yes, I will share it with them, even though I think it's terrible, the safer that person is. And spend as much time as you can in the places you feel safe so that your resources are freed up to do these other things. Because you could be working on it's a trope, right? The person who works on the great American novel for their entire life and never shows it to anybody, spends thousands of hours on it. Just purely, if we're talking about art, which is meant to be shared with an audience, it's meant to have an impact on other people, you're not going to do very well at it if you never show it to other people, because it's all an idea of how it will impact somebody. And again, some people, 4.5 days and then I fail is a lot worse. So now it's like, oh man, I spent 3 years on this novel. I can't show it to anybody, because then they'll be like, you spent 3 years on this? Man, I wish I'd shown it to them when I was 2 months in. But if it's 2 months in, you're like, no, I just need a couple more months, then I'll show them. Find people who are safe for you, contexts who are safe for you, and be there as much as possible.
Awesome. There's a lot of topics that were brought up at the end that we could talk about, but that's it for this hour. Thank you guys for joining us again here at This Is Not Therapy Hour. We'll be here again next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. In the meantime, feel free to check us out on Twitter and Instagram at EF_artistry. And send us messages if you want to us to talk about something, a specific topic, or explore something that you've heard before that we didn't explain enough, or in a way that's accessible. Let us know. We're willing to talk about those things. Until then, I hope everyone has a great week. Happy end of Pride Month, and we will see you guys next week.
Thank you all.